Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rick Rybeck. I'm the Director of Just Economics, and welcome to Reducing Sprawl, Poverty, and Inequality by Terminating Real Estate Speculation. Now, I guess you might want to know if this is the right presentation for you. So, does your community need more jobs or more affordable housing? Do you need more effective infrastructure to reduce traffic, to protect the environment and reduce sprawl, and to facilitate private development and job creation? Do you need more and more equitable funding for that infrastructure? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then this session is for you. Um, Economic justice and racial justice are related, but they're different. Now, people are treated differently based on their skin color. This is not what most of us want, but it is a reality that we must acknowledge and work to overcome. This session will focus on economic justice. As I mentioned, they're linked. Dr. King is famous for saying, "What good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger?" So with that in mind, we'll proceed. And by way of introduction, I guess I'm sort of curious about whether folks are familiar with reality TV. It's a form of entertainment that is perhaps I'm not totally well versed with it, but I've seen it around, and as I understand it, you have participants and contestants. You're put in a situation, a competition, or a contest. Now, by itself, that might not make it terribly interesting. So the organizers do something special to spice it up. They create incentives to behave badly. And what do people do when you give them incentives to behave badly? They behave badly. And for some of us, apparently we find this irresistible in terms of entertainment. And whether this is good entertainment or not, I'm not going to weigh in on that. But certainly, we shouldn't be doing this in real life. But I think we do. So, for example, if we look at our standard property tax, we reward people with lower taxes when they allow buildings to deteriorate or leave valuable land vacant. And on the other hand, we punish people with higher taxes when they create or improve buildings. So, as we think about this reality TV and incentives to behave badly, the thing to remember is let's not hate the players. Let's change the rules of the game. So, the first thing I want to talk about is something that you're probably all familiar with, which I refer to as no good deed goes unpunished. And there was a working class neighborhood in London where people had to pay a toll to get to their jobs on the other side of the river. Now, the public felt that this was very unfair, and they asked the government to remove the toll. After the toll was removed, rents in this neighborhood went up by the amount of the foregone toll. As a result, workers were not better off. In fact, if they didn't use the bridge, they were worse off because they didn't get the benefit, but their rents went up anyway. And the moral of the story is that public funds, which were spent to help low-income residents, ended up enriching landlords instead. Now, this is a story that was told by Winston Churchill in an address to Parliament in 1903. So this is a summation. If we see distressed or low-income communities, we might say, well, what can we do to help them? Maybe better schools, better public safety, better access to jobs and education through improving roads or transit or both. And yet, if we accomplish any of these improvements, land prices will rise, rents will rise, and the intended beneficiaries might be displaced. Tax dollars intended to help the poor end up enriching landowners, who, of course, tend not to be so poor. So, related to the no good deed goes unpunished scenario is something that I refer to as the infrastructure conundrum. And here you'll see my sort of Picasso-like rendering of a city. And I think people can see my cursor. So here we have a suburban community or village. There's a major city that you can't see that's off the screen to the south, if you will. And these lines represent infrastructure. They could be water pipes and sewer pipes. They could be transit. They could be roads. For the sake of this discussion, let's call them roads. And you'll see that there's a thick line from the center of the suburban village going to the south that's connecting it to the big city. And basically what this represents is a newly improved road that provides better access to the big city. And as a result of this new and improved infrastructure, there's now new opportunity to develop here. And that's what this yellow rectangle represents, the new growth opportunity created by this thick black line, this new and improved infrastructure. And what we see is, as a result, new development occurs. You see, here's where we started with, and now, as a result of the infrastructure, new development takes place. You see the street grid expanding. But something else goes on as well. Landowners quickly realize that their land is much more valuable than it used to be. And some of them are thinking, well, why should I sell my land today at today's price when the land might be much more valuable in the future? So some landowners will either refuse to sell, and others will try to sell their land at a price that they think it will get in the future. But of course, developers will only buy land at prices that can be supported by their potential tenants or buyers. So as land prices rise in excess of what tenants or buyers will pay, the developers begin to seek cheaper but more remote sites. And that's what you see here in the pink. These are land out here is cheaper. Of course, it's cheaper because it doesn't have access to the good infrastructure. So growth actually ends up getting diverted to these cheaper and more remote sites. Even though there's plenty of excess capacity here, growth is happening out in these areas. And perhaps on a weekend when people go out to look at the homes out in these pink areas, the road works just fine. But on Monday morning, when everybody tries to get on these little narrow roads, they don't fit. And so the residents and businesses at these remote locations petition the politicians for an extension of the transportation facility or service to their area. Now, politicians would love to make everybody happy, but budget constraints prevent that. And as a result, only one of these remote communities is actually going to receive the infrastructure. And here we see what happens. This community in the sort of center bottom here, they got the extension of the transit or the road, and all of a sudden the cycle starts over again. There's new growth opportunity, new growth occurs, but while this is happening, land prices around here rise, choking off development and pushing development even farther away to this site in the upper right-hand corner. So this is a partial explanation of how sprawl occurs. There's much more to it than this, but this is an important part of how sprawl works. So this is how I would summarize the infrastructure conundrum. We create infrastructure to facilitate development, but if that infrastructure is well designed and well constructed, it inflates the price of well-served land. Higher land prices then push development to cheaper but more remote sites. Communities run after new development with more infrastructure, but as we saw previously, they never catch up. And the resulting sprawl not only impairs the environment and creates auto dependency and traffic congestion, it also hurts taxpayers due to the duplication of expensive infrastructure at low density areas. Sprawl also impairs economic productivity. Activities at cheaper, subprime locations are less productive. Time is wasted in traffic for workers, customers, and for freight deliveries. Dispersed activities reduce opportunities for collaboration and innovation. High land and transportation costs are a burden on both residents and businesses. Infrastructure duplication, as mentioned before, is expensive and also a burden on residents and businesses because it has to be paid for. And the high land prices are both a self-fulfilling prophecy and a self-defeating one, exacerbating economic booms and busts. Sprawl-induced burdens on residents and businesses exacerbate high housing costs and unemployment. So let's look at what's causing the infrastructure conundrum. It's land speculation, and you'll see the photographs on the left show land speculation. Land speculation is the buying of land, not to use it, but to hold it for future appreciation. Land speculation creates nothing of value. However, it does create an artificial scarcity of developable land, particularly at prime locations. And this artificial scarcity results in real increases in land prices. It results in sprawl and periodic economic booms and busts. It is the ability of private landowners to appropriate publicly created land value that is the fuel for land speculation. So here's a diagram that sort of talks about what we've just been talking about. And this shows you how land values are created and what the consequences are. I hope you can all see my cursor here, but we're going to sort of follow this diagram. This upside down triangle represents the public. You'll see tenants here, and by tenants I mean not only residential tenants, but businesses as well. The vast majority of businesses don't own their place of business, they rent it. So most businesses are tenants also. And of course, you also have landowners, smaller number down here, and a subset of landowners are what I call owners of prime sites. These are sites in the downtown, next to your highway interchanges, next to your transit stops, next to the good schools. And of course, I'm sorry, we're on the wrong slide here. What happens is the public basically is paying taxes on labor and capital to the government. The government is using these taxes to create public goods and services. And many of these public goods and services end up creating enhanced land values. A small percentage of land value trickles back to the government through the property tax. The vast majority, the lion's share, becomes a windfall to landowners, and particularly to these few owners of prime sites. And the main thing to keep in mind is that most taxpayers end up paying for infrastructure twice. First, they pay in taxes right here. But second, if they want to have their home or their business next to the new infrastructure that their taxes have paid for, they go to the owner of the prime site and say, I want to rent this space or buy this space. And the owner says, well, any place like this anywhere else would cost you X dollars, but here, because you're next to the new shiny infrastructure, you have to pay X plus Y. So we pay a second time for infrastructure through this, what I call a rent premium for prime locations. So we end up paying twice for infrastructure. Not a very appealing proposition. And what do we do about it? Well, this is the solution. As you can see, these diagrams look very similar. The big difference is right in here. Instead of just a small amount of publicly created land value going back to the public sector, we've made land value return much more robust. And as you can see, this looks like basically a self-sustaining loop. So the government, sorry about that, the government is creating public goods and services and land values, and then these publicly created land values come back to the government, allowing for the operations, maintenance, and creation of the infrastructure that created that value in the first place. And the thing that's very interesting about this approach is that as a result of having more publicly created land values returned to the government, taxes on labor and capital can be reduced, which make the economy work much better. And because land values are being returned to the government, land prices don't go up so much. And what that means is that the rent premium that people pay to locate next to new infrastructure is much lower than under the first scenario. So the solution to the infrastructure conundrum, and no good deed goes unpunished, is land value return and recycling. It removes the windfall to landowners, and therefore removes the incentive for land speculation. So land value return and recycling. As we said before, when infrastructure is well designed and well executed, it inflates the price of nearby land. And returning publicly created land value to the public sector that created it and recycling it for infrastructure creation, operation, and maintenance is what I refer to as land value return and recycling, or LVRR. So I'm going to talk about how this technique helps us overcome the infrastructure conundrum and no good deed goes unpunished, how it promotes job creation and affordable housing. And I think the best way to do that is by comparing different funding mechanisms. And so let me just start off by noting that different funding mechanisms have different impacts on behavior. Perhaps the easiest thing to understand is water and sewer. Most of us pay for water with a per gallon fee, and this encourages conservation. We tell our kids, don't leave the faucet running. Why? Well, because we don't want to pay the high water bill. And if we have a leaky faucet, we don't just see money going down the drain. We don't just see water going down the drain, we see our money going down the drain. So that encourages us to fix our leaky faucet. Now, we could pay for water and sewer with a sales tax. Sales taxes raise lots of money. But if we paid for water and sewer with a sales tax, would we tell our kids not to leave the tap running? Would we be motivated to fix our leaky faucet? And if we didn't fix our leaky faucet, would we go out and buy something we didn't need just so that we could compensate the water authority with some sales tax for the water that we were wasting? Probably not. So how we pay for things is just as important as how much money we raise to pay for them. And that's going to be one of the key takeaways for our discussion. How we pay for infrastructure is just as important as how much money we raise. So, just as in the case of water, now we're going to be talking about land development. And development fees and land value return have very different impacts on development decisions and land use. So let's dive into that. Here you see another brilliant illustration of mine, suitable for framing. Afterwards, you can write me and I'll autograph you a copy. But as you can see up here, we have two parcels of land. One is vacant on the left. The one on the right has a 3-story building. And here in between the two parcels of land is something that's infrastructure. It might be a road, it might be a transit stop, or both. Now, some people are thinking about how do we fund infrastructure? And to them, a development fee might make sense. What they're thinking is, as land, like here on the right, as it gets more intensively developed, more people are going to be using and benefiting from the street or the transit station adjacent to the property. So property owners should pay based on how intensively the land is developed. That's the development fee approach. Another approach, called land value return and recycling, says that both these lots, the lot on the right and on the left, are receiving the same opportunity benefit from the infrastructure. And therefore, these landowners should pay the same for that benefit regardless of whether or not the property is developed. So under this scenario, property owners are paying based on the value they receive from public benefits, from public facilities. So now let's work through the development fee and the land value return fee step by step to see how they work and see how their incentives are different. We're going to start with the development fee. As we mentioned, the development fee is imposed on building value to offset infrastructure costs. And as we saw in the illustration for the person who owned the vacant lot, well, if there's no building, there's no fee. So because the development fee only occurs if there's a building produced, it's basically a cost of production. Economics 101 tells us that if you increase the cost of production, the quantity of buildings produced will go down. And as a result, the price of what's left over goes up. So I ask a question to the audience. If we're creating new infrastructure, do we want to reduce development near that infrastructure and increase its price? I don't think so. But that's what happens with a development fee. A fee on building value appropriates privately created value. It burdens builders, future occupants, and consumers. Let's take a look at land value return and recycling. Land value return is based on land value. The land supply is not reduced by land value return and recycling. And the reason why is because, unlike buildings, land is not produced. So land value return is not a cost of production, it's a cost of ownership. And let me explain why that's significant. So where do land prices come from? I mean, we know that building prices are related to the cost of producing buildings, but as we just said, land is not produced. So land price reflects the expected benefits of land ownership. In other words, the amount of money I'm willing to pay for a piece of land is related to the benefits I expect to receive from owning it. So if I impose a cost of ownership, if I increase the cost of ownership, that reduces the benefits of ownership and reduces the price. This slide is perhaps the most difficult part of my whole presentation for most of us to understand. And the reason is that most of us take it for granted that if we put a fee or a tax on something, the price goes up. And why do we take that for granted? Well, the reason is that 90 or 95% of what we're familiar with is all stuff that's produced, like the clothes that we're wearing, the laptop we're using, the table that the laptop sits on, the building that we're sitting in. All of these things are things that are produced, and taxes and fees as costs of production cause production to shrink and prices to go up. What makes land unique, and what makes this a little hard to understand, is that the supply of land does not shrink when we put a fee or a tax on it. And as a result, because the fee on land is a cost of ownership and reduces the benefits of ownership, imposing a fee on land value causes land prices to go down. So please pay attention to that. So the nice thing about land value return is that it does not burden developers, occupants, or consumers. So now let's go back to our example of the two lots and the infrastructure that we need to pay for. And let's say that the community needs to raise $1,000 in revenue to pay for this infrastructure, either in total or on an annual basis, doesn't matter. So here's the development fee. And under a development fee approach, the vacant lot here pays zero, which means the only other taxpayer has to pay the whole $1,000. Under the land value return and recycling approach, we've determined that both of these properties are receiving the same benefit from the infrastructure here. Therefore, we're going to split the cost equally. Both landowners are going to pay $500. So the nice thing about this approach is that we're not punishing this owner for developing, and we're not discouraging this owner from developing. And in fact, we're actually encouraging this owner to develop. Why? Because under a development fee approach, they're paying nothing. And so it's very easy for them to sit and wait until land prices go up. But under the land value return approach, even though they're not getting any money in revenue from this site, they're paying for that infrastructure. So that motivates them to develop the land so that they can get some revenue from which to pay the fee. So we were just talking about landowner responses. As most of you know, most people if they have a fee or a tax, they'll do anything to avoid it. And there are ways to avoid the fee on development. You can reduce the number, size, or quality of new buildings that you produce if you're a developer. And if you really want to build a new building, maybe you'll build it in a lower tax jurisdiction somewhere else. And if you have an existing building, you can reduce the development fee by reducing maintenance and allowing your existing building to deteriorate. But how do you avoid land value return? I would suggest that it's really not possible to do that. Why? Well, the main reason is, unlike the value of the building, which is created by the owner, the building owner, the value of land is not created by the landowner. The value of land is created by the community and what the community does around it to make it a valuable place to live or work. So, and I don't know if anybody in the audience has tried that, but it's very difficult to move a piece of land from a high tax jurisdiction to a low tax jurisdiction. Has anybody tried it? If you have, please put it in the chat. I'd be anxious to learn about it, because the logistics are really nasty. I mean, you have a lot of dump trucks, you're moving a lot of dirt, and at the end of the day, you still have a piece of land in a high tax jurisdiction. So the bottom line is, you can't avoid a fee on land value. And that, therefore, because of that higher fee, as we were mentioning before, it will encourage the landowner to develop that land or sell to somebody who will. So this is how we overcome the infrastructure conundrum. Under land value return, landowners pay for infrastructure benefits in proportion to the benefits received. The highest payments are due from high-value sites which are near urban infrastructure amenities, like transit, streets, good schools, etc. Land value return encourages development of that high-value land. So instead of pushing development away from infrastructure, which is what the status quo does, land value return actually pulls development to be close to the transportation and other infrastructure amenities that we create. And after all, isn't that where we want development to occur? And as a result, land value return reduces sprawl, it reduces infrastructure duplication, and it reduces per capita infrastructure costs. So let me talk briefly about a few examples of how this works in the real world. And if you're interested in innovation, I always say the best place to find it is back in history. So a lot of you are familiar with transit-oriented development. This example is about development-oriented transit. And let me explain what I mean by that. In the 1890s, the Chevy Chase Land Company bought 1,700 acres of farms and forests on both sides of the DC-Maryland border. And this land in the 1890s was very cheap because it was difficult to get to the jobs and shops downtown. Now, that downtown was about 5 or 6 miles away. And of course, in the 1890s, most people didn't have transportation. If you were wealthy, you had a horse. And most people didn't have horses. They walked to get where they needed to go. So this area was very cheap because it was inaccessible to downtown. But after they bought this very cheap farmland, the Chevy Chase Land Company constructed a streetcar line from downtown to its land holdings. And the Chevy Chase Land Company charged a few pennies to ride the streetcar. Now, the fares may have covered the cost of the conductor, but they certainly didn't cover the cost of laying down the rails or paying for the cars themselves. So was this an act of charity or altruism on the part of the Chevy Chase Land Company? Absolutely not. The Chevy Chase Land Company recouped its costs and more because now that it was connected to this cheap and convenient form of transportation, its land became very valuable for homes and businesses. If the Chevy Chase Land Company had attempted to recoup all of the streetcar costs through the fare box, the fares for the streetcars would have been so expensive that nobody would have ridden it. And as a result, both the streetcar project and the land development projects would have failed. So the lesson here is, it's important to get the balance right between user fees, like fares or per gallon fees for water, those are user fees, and access fees or fees based on land value. Here's another example, disaster recovery in San Francisco. In 1906, San Francisco suffered from a powerful earthquake, and even more devastation was caused by the many fires that ensued. There was no federal emergency management agency, and the federal government was not providing disaster recovery grants. And yet, in spite of that, San Francisco was quickly rebuilt as a compact and vibrant city. Why? In part because San Francisco's property tax was minimal on buildings and mostly on the value of land. So after the disaster, landowners who didn't want to lose their property through tax default needed to redevelop quickly so that they could generate income from which to pay their taxes. Now, the other thing that we know about policy changes is that it's very difficult to have a controlled experiment. We may implement a policy change, and then we may see change happen in the real world, but we're always left with this question in our mind. Did the policy change cause this change in the real world, or would it have happened anyway? Well, here we have an example of what was really close to a controlled experiment in 3 cities near Pittsburgh: McKeesport, Duquesne, and Clairton. So McKeesport, Duquesne, and Clairton are similar steel towns in the Pittsburgh region. By the mid-1970s, each town's steel mill had closed down. The number and value of building permits declined in each city for several consecutive years. Then McKeesport adopted a 2-rate property tax. And by that, what I mean is they reduced the tax rate applied to privately created building values, but increased the tax rate for publicly created land value. Building permits increased for 3 consecutive years. And that's exactly what the theory would have predicted, but you have to ask yourself, would this have happened anyway? Well, fortunately, almost next door were Duquesne and Clairton. And as you can see from this graph, that in the 3 years after McKeesport adopted this reform, their building permits went up by almost 40%. But at the same time, in nearby Duquesne and Clairton, the number and value of building permits continued to decline. So this is about as close to a controlled experiment as you can get. And it shows that not only does the theory make sense, but it actually works in practice. And of course, what happened was that Duquesne and Clairton noticed what was going on in McKeesport, and they said, hey, we should do that too. So when they adopted the split rate or 2-rate property tax in their towns, building permits went up in their towns also. Now, the thing to note is that if you go to McKeesport, Duquesne, and Clairton today, these are still very distressed cities. The tax reform that was very successful still was not enough to bring back the steel factories and the thousands of good-paying jobs that these factories provided. So these cities are not gardens of Eden by any stretch of the imagination. But what this experiment shows is that at whatever stage of the business cycle your community is in, even during the depths of a recession or a depression, land value return can help your community work at a better level. Its economy will perform better. More people will be employed, and that's important. So just to wrap up, I want to just explain that there are many tools to use to shape both the amount and affordability of development. Of course, there's zoning. And under zoning, we have form-based codes. We can reduce or eliminate minimum parking requirements. Some people are looking at performance-based zoning, where we prohibit certain defined negative externalities without mandating or prohibiting specific uses. That's an approach. And then there are other tools as well: urban growth boundaries, transferable development rights, subdivision regulations, building codes. Public goods and services. So, for example, as I mentioned before, if we invest in new streets or transit or make the schools better, that can induce development as well. How do we design the streets that we put in the transportation network? Some types of designs are very favorable for auto use and make pedestrian life very difficult and dangerous. Other types of design are favorable for transit, pedestrians, and cyclists. So that makes a difference. And of course, there's job training and startup assistance for new business. And here at the bottom is what we were talking about so far today: user fees, access fees, and development fees. So the point of this slide is to say that the things that we've been talking about today are certainly not the only tools that are required. However, if we ignore access fees, land value return, all these other tools become either less effective or even counterproductive. And of course, what I mean by that is without land value return, we end up in the world of no good deed goes unpunished and the infrastructure conundrum. So these tools are all important, but access fees and land value return in particular is important for job creation, affordable housing, and compact, environmentally friendly development. So I'm going to talk briefly about what the opportunities are for implementation, and then we can get to your questions. So clearly, we have a housing affordability crisis in our country. Now, maybe not everywhere. So for example, in many Rust Belt cities, homes seem to be very cheap. But if you're in a Rust Belt city and you're unemployed, even a cheap house can be unaffordable. On the other hand, in Silicon Valley, employment and wages are very robust. Many households there are earning six-figure incomes. Yet even they have difficulty finding affordable housing in Silicon Valley. So what this shows is that inflation in housing prices outpaces wage gains. Why is housing so much more expensive in places with robust economies? Is it because labor is more expensive, or because the brick or the wood or the pipes cost more? Not really. Here's a graph that shows the cost of different housing cost components. And if you can see my cursor, this dotted line here is the consumer price index. That's inflation. This solid line represents building costs, material costs. And this dotted line that runs just above it, those are labor costs. And you can see they're running a little bit higher than inflation, but not much. What has really driven housing affordability or inaffordability through the roof? It's the price of land. That's this line right here. So when people say we have a problem of housing affordability, I would differ. I say we don't have a problem of housing affordability. We have a crisis of land affordability. That's the real problem. And let's see. So that's one opportunity. Also, communities are desperate for infrastructure funding. As we showed, under the status quo today, most communities are giving away enormous amounts of publicly created land value to whoever is lucky or shrewd enough to own the best served land. And communities simply can't afford to continue doing that. Land value return can help make infrastructure financially self-sustaining. If you remember that diagram that we had at the beginning that showed that by returning land value to the public sector that creates it, infrastructure can become financially self-sustaining. If not completely, at least to a much greater degree than today. And of course, communities can't afford sprawl either. Land value return and recycling in cities reduces sprawl, its environmental and fiscal harms. And development impact fees and exactions, fees on development, actually, even though I may have seemed to put them down earlier, they do have their place and are appropriate in rural areas where infrastructure is lacking and development is inappropriate. In those places, development impact fees can be appropriate to discourage premature development of land that's more appropriately saved for agriculture, conservation, or recreation. And finally, in terms of dealing with inequality, land value return and recycling provides a good solution to the no good deed goes unpunished. It reduces the unearned windfalls to land speculators. And finally, there's some good news. Communities are already doing it. Through the traditional property tax, which is levied, I think, in just about every community, all communities are now levying a property tax both on privately created building value and publicly created land value. So to the extent that they're levying a tax against land value, most communities are already practicing some level of land value return and recycling. However, as shown in that diagram near the beginning of the talk, typically that land value return and recycling is pretty minuscule. But by making it more robust, by gradually shifting the property tax off of building values and onto publicly created land values, this is an incremental change that can have profound and beneficial effects. And it also helps avoid windfalls and wipeouts by doing this gradually. So that makes it politically more palatable as well. So at this point, I'll conclude my formal presentation and open it up for questions and comments. Caitlin, do you have any questions that you or the audience like? And if people are being shy, I have some pre-prepared sort of frequently asked questions that I can go to also.
Yeah, so thanks, Rick. This was fantastic. I am seeing some questions about how this might mess with the incentives around multifamily versus single family development, home ownership properties versus rental properties. And so would love to just hear you speak to how you see this impacting those type of markets.
Well, that's a good question. And basically, some people think that this will have no impact on development. They think that it's beside the point. And as I think some of the slides and the historical examples showed, that's actually not the case. The development community is responsive to these economic incentives. Then on the other side, we have people who say, oh, this is going to be terrible because if we do this, we'll have skyscrapers everywhere, and wouldn't that be awful? And the fact is that that's where the interplay between zoning and land value return come into play. So let's say, for example, we have a piece of Iowa cornfield that's now growing corn, and we rezone it for skyscrapers like you have in Manhattan. Well, nobody wants to be in a skyscraper in the middle of an Iowa cornfield. So the land value in Iowa is going to continue to be low. And even if you put a land value tax on it, that farmer isn't going to be paying much. And growing corn or wheat or soybeans is probably still going to be the best way to get a return. On the other hand, let's think about downtown Manhattan and say that we have a piece of land that's zoned for a 10-story building. Let's say, are we going to worry that people are going to put up a 100-story building on the land that's zoned for 10 stories? Well, if the land is zoned for 10 stories, its value reflects that zoning. So nobody's going to pay 100-story prices for land on which you can only put a 10-story building. And so the value of the land will reflect what the zoning allows, and therefore a tax based on land value will encourage development up to, but not exceeding what the zoning will allow. So have I kind of answered that question, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. It feels like if you're going to go this route, then getting your zoning right becomes incredibly important.
Very important. And in fact, it's interesting. I live in Washington, D.C., and in the late 70s and early 1980s, there was we did not have a comprehensive plan. I won't go into why that was the case, but there was a citizens group that was trying to lobby the mayor for a comprehensive plan to guide our zoning. And one of the things that we noticed when we were doing the work was that there was a lot more land zoned for office development than there was foreseeable demand. And the question was, why is there so much land devoted to offices when it's more than what we saw was demanded? And my hunch is that the Office of Planning realized that if they only zoned land for offices based on what was likely to be demanded, that would give the landowners huge monopoly power. And they'd charge exorbitant prices for people to put office buildings. So they zoned more land for offices than was needed, hoping that the landowners would compete with each other. But that was just a very mistaken approach. I think land value return is a much more equitable and effective way of making sure you get the right development in the right place.
Yeah. Rick, I got curious as you were talking, thinking about kind of how this would play out in my own community, and if I wanted to try to get my city to do this, what would it take? Could you talk a little bit about kind of the stakeholders that you see coming together and saying, yes, we're going to push for this together? And then on the flip side, who in a typical community does this not help? Who might say, hey, wait a second, this isn't in my interest. I want to stand up and say, don't take money out of my pocket, or whatever the case may be.
Right. So the people who would help the most probably are tenants. And these are both residential and business tenants. They will probably do better under a land value return and recycling approach than they do under the status quo, primarily because there'll be more development in the right place, and that will help bring prices down and leave people with more disposable income if they're residents, and more discretionary income to reinvest in their business if they're a business. So that's a plus. Other people who would support this ought to be unions, right? Because it's putting more development in the right place and discouraging land speculation. That's going to mean more jobs for people. So unions should support this. Groups that support social and environmental justice should support this. Because right now what we're doing, there are a lot of people who say, oh, I don't support income redistribution. But if we go back to that slide early on in my presentation, and if you'll permit me to go back there, let me see if I can get there. Yeah. Can everybody see this slide now?
I think you're going to need to reshare your screen.
Are we still back on where I was before?
I think we're just seeing you and me.
I see.
Have to go back down and hit share again.
Okay, let me do this. So let me find where we're at here. So I will hit share and share screen and see if I can find the right window. How's that? Are people seeing the diagram now?
Yep.
Okay, so as I mentioned, there are a lot of people who say they don't favor income redistribution. And usually when people say that, they're talking about taking money from the wealthy and giving it to the poor. But this is a diagram of the status quo. And as I showed or tried to show earlier, what we're doing is we're taking money from everybody and we're giving it to this tiny few people here who are the wealthiest and most powerful in the country, the people who own prime sites. So actually the status quo is doing income redistribution, but we're taking from the poor and giving to the rich. And so if you want to know who's opposed to this, these folks right here. Now, my hunch is that most of the people in the audience have never thought about what we've talked about today. That most people, if you say, well, what do you think about the property tax? They think it's just one tax. But what we've learned today is actually two different taxes. It's a tax on privately created building values and a tax on publicly created land value. And these two taxes work in kind of opposite ways. So most people don't understand this. They don't realize that by reducing the tax on buildings, we can make buildings more affordable. And by increasing the tax on land, we can make land more affordable. And therefore, shifting the tax off of buildings onto land without new spending, without depriving the cities of any revenue that they need, we can make both buildings and land more affordable. Now, that's pretty exciting, I think. But who's going to oppose it? Well, the few people who understand this system are the land speculators. And they're going to oppose it tooth and nail. And they're going to say, oh, if you do this, you're going to have skyscrapers everywhere. They're going to tell a lot of fibs about what will happen. And they'll try to scare people about it. But that's pretty much, if I've sort of given a little lay of the land about who's in favor and who's opposed. You might also have some people who are in favor of historic preservation being nervous that if we make this transition that favors development, that it might be deleterious to historic preservation. And all that means is, again, as you mentioned, Caitlin, you need to pay attention to your zoning regulations and you need to pay attention to your historic preservation regulations and incentives. And if those are all properly aligned, I think they can be compatible.
Yeah, and that's really helpful. And I think too, you mentioned that this, because property taxes are already a thing, it makes it easier to start implementing a gradual approach. You're just shifting.
Right. I mean, one of the things that would happen if we did this all at once, started taxing buildings at zero and land very high, is that some people would have huge tax reductions and other people would have huge tax increases. And that would be very unsettling and would create a lot of political backlash. And it wouldn't be fair because even the land speculators, as I said when we were talking about reality TV, don't hate the players, change the rules of the game. I mean, even the people I'm not very fond of, like people who speculate in land, who own surface parking lots in downtown, they're just doing what the system tells them to do. And if we were to go and punish them inordinately very quickly, that wouldn't be fair. So if you phase this in gradually over time, people, even the speculators, could reorient their behavior and make the changes in their investment strategy so they can take advantage of the new incentives. And then it becomes a win-win for everybody.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I would love to hear more about you. I think you answered the question well in terms of the importance of zoning and kind of managing counter incentives around affordable housing. But I hear from affordable housing developers how much property tax does impact their ability to keep housing affordable. And this does really feel like a really good answer to that.
Well, this is, I didn't talk about it very much, but, we talked about, if you're looking at this diagram, how little bit of the publicly created land value gets returned to the public. But on the other side of the coin, look at the taxes on labor and capital. Right now, we want people who own buildings to make energy saving improvements, right? We want them to add insulation, maybe put solar on the roof, do these good things to make their buildings more environmentally friendly and sustainable, right? Mm-hmm. And there are several reasons. One is it's good for the environment. Two, it creates jobs. And weatherizing a house or putting solar on the roof, that's not a job that can be outsourced to China or some foreign country. That has to be done here, right at home. So these are good jobs. It's good for the environment. It seems to be like a win-win. And many people are puzzled why this doesn't happen. Part of the reason is that in order to do this, I have to make a big investment today, right? Add insulation, put in solar, do that, right? I spend money today. And then I have lower utility bills going into the future. Hopefully, over time, as a result of the lower utility bills, I break even on my investment, right? Are you with me?
Yep. Yep.
Right. But now think about how the status quo treats this. Not only do I have to recoup the cost of the labor and materials for my investment, but when I put solar on the roof or increase the insulation, the assessor, rightly so, says, oh, your building's more valuable. So now I have to pay an additional property tax, not just the year that I make the improvement, but every year thereafter that improvement adds value. So if you take this stream of future property tax payments at 1 or 2% a year, it doesn't sound like a lot. But if you collapse it into a one-time payment like a sales tax, it has the economic impact of a 10 to 20% sales tax.
Yeah.
Now that's pretty steep. If I went to the city council and said, I know you need money, how about a 10 to 20% sales tax on construction, labor, and materials? The city council would say, Rick, we need more money, but that's a terrible idea. This would make buildings too expensive. Well, without realizing it, that's what our existing property tax is doing. We're discouraging people from maintaining and improving existing buildings, never mind building new ones.
Right.
And in terms of these energy saving improvements, we push the payoff period so far into the future that people say, oh, it's just not worth doing. So this transition not only encourages the development of vacant lots in the downtown, which would be a good thing, but it encourages little small projects, little fix-up things. And that employs local people, it creates more jobs, and it will bring down the cost of homes and commercial space as well. It will make everything work better and more fairly.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rick. This has been a really, really fantastic conversation. I'm excited about this just as a new way of thinking and a different tool in the toolbox for folks. So thank you for sharing. I just want to lift up and agree with some of the comments saying that your diagrams, your artwork that you are offering framed and autographed actually really did a fantastic job of explaining some really complicated concepts. So
well,
thank you so much.
That's very generous. And if I could just part with a few words, I just want to remind people that how we raise money for public goods and services is just as important as how much we raise. And while the tool that we've talked about today is not the only tool in the toolbox, if we overlook this one, all the other tools that we use end up biting us in the rear end as a result of the no good deed goes unpunished scenario. So it's really important that even though we need to do these other things, if we don't do land value return and recycling, we're kind of doomed to shoot ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I can help you or anyone in the audience move from the status quo to this better scenario, I'm more than happy to do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thanks to our audience. Thanks, guys.